Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Rain fell like a mother's tears that day, heavy, warm, and constant, washing the dust off the tin roofs of Alubo. Shelter sat on a narrow bench outside her father's worn compound, her back straight but her spirit bent. Her eyes were fixed on Max, who stood beneath the almond tree, holding out a small blue nylon with roasted groundnuts and a sachet of milk. The gift was simple, almost laughable, but Max's hands trembled as though he was offering her a diamond ring. Shelter stared at it, and then at him. Tall, lean, brown-skinned Max, with cheekbones like carved wood, lips that always trembled when he smiled too hard, and fingers stained with phone parts and engine grease. His love was loud in silence, deep without needing many words. Yet she felt the weight of eyes around her, her mother's judgment, her sister's sarcasm, her friends' laughter. Love, they said, was not enough. "You'll eat love, Abby?" Her mother had sneered once, snapping her fingers in the air. Shelter had laughed then to hide the sting, but her heart always circled back to Max. She remembered how he once walked her home barefoot after the rain, shoes in hand, so she wouldn't step into the mud alone. But reality, like the morning bell of a local church, kept ringing. Max was broke, not just financially, but in the way society feared. No savings, no house, no connections. Just a boy with a tired kiosk and a dream that kept leaking from every corner like a cracked calabash. And yet, as the raindrops tapped the roof like a ticking clock, she knew that what she held with Max was the kind of peace that wealth couldn't replicate. Weeks passed like worn-out sandals dragging on gravel, uneventful, yet loud in their discomfort. The town of Alubo began to buzz with wedding plans, but not hers. A friend of her cousin's was marrying into money, and suddenly all conversations in Shelter's home revolved around silk wrappers, Ankara combinations, and how men of status chose their wives. It was there, during that celebration beneath the blinking white and blue lights, that she first met Felix Olenrauju. He was as smooth as freshly ironed linen, tall with a commanding voice, full beard that connected like royalty, and eyes that knew too much. His suit didn't just fit, it obeyed him. The man moved like he was owed the world, and when he spoke, everyone around him laughed, even when his jokes weren't funny. He called Shelter gold in human form, and said she was wasted on a place like Alubo. Max, who attended the wedding too, sat at the far end with dust on his shoes, and the scent of engine oil still clinging to his sleeves. He saw the way Shelter looked at Felix, the way her smile hesitated before returning to her lips. He didn't protest. He never did. When love is true, it doesn't beg. It waits. But sometimes waiting is a trap for fools. "My daughter," her mother whispered in her ear that night, "this one is a doorway. Don't be stuck knocking on broken gates." By the next week, Felix sent a car to pick her. They said it was just to show her Lagos, to take her to a dinner. She returned 3 days later, wearing a new gown and silence as perfume. Max saw her. She avoided his eyes. The next time he tried to hold her hand, she told him gently, "We can't keep doing this. I need more." Max didn't fight her. He simply nodded with the stillness of a man who had just watched the sky collapse quietly. He folded the small note she gave him, an apology written with more shame than ink, and walked away. No last hug, no raised voice, just an ending that sounded like a slow leak in a quiet room. Shelter moved into a world of tinted windows and imported leather. Felix had a house in a highbrow estate called Hillview, where the gates responded to sensors and the curtains moved with remote controls. She slept on mattresses that remembered her shape and woke to housekeepers who bowed with every greeting. At first, it felt like rebirth. Every room echoed power. The scent of air fresheners whispered money. But beneath it all was a strange coldness. Felix was generous with gifts, but stingy with affection. He never asked about her dreams, only her dresses. When he introduced her to his friends, he said, "This is Shelter. She's with me," as though she were a handbag or wristwatch. Still, she kept smiling, because to complain was to admit regret, and regret was a luxury she refused to entertain. The Bible says in Proverbs 14 verse 1, "The wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears hers down." She repeated that to herself every time doubt crept in. Maybe she was building. Maybe the weight she felt was just a labor of growth. But one night, as Felix bragged over dinner about the cars he gifted other women before her, something in Shelter's chest began to break. Slowly, quietly, like ice thawing beneath a rug. She began to miss the little things, the honest things. Max's laughter when his phone dropped in water. The way he always said sorry even when she was the one at fault. She missed the days they shared mangoes with pepper and salt at the back of his kiosk, and how he would hum soft gospel songs when fixing a cracked screen. She missed being seen, not just watched. Felix, with all his wealth, didn't see her. Not really. One evening, after a long meeting with his business partners, he returned home furious, blaming her for a wine stain on his rug. "If you can't manage this house, I'll find someone who can," he barked. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was already a rebellion. That night, while he slept like Goliath in his arrogance, she stepped out to the balcony and looked up at the stars, silent, scattered, and far. She whispered, "God, if you see me, speak." The only answer was the breeze that touched her neck. Yet somehow, that whispering wind carried more warmth than the man inside. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel crazy for wanting more than comfort. She wanted peace. She wanted respect. She wanted her voice back. And even though the world had told her that love alone couldn't feed a woman, she now understood something deeper, that money without mercy is just another form of prison. The days in Hillview began to feel like an echo, each one repeating the last with the same sterile greetings, the same polished marble floors, and the same hollow luxury. Shelter learned early not to expect Felix to ask about her day. If she tried to share something personal, he'd wave his hand as though swatting at a fly. He lived in a world where emotions were inconveniences and listening was a favor. Whenever guests came over, he told stories about money like a comedian cracking jokes. "I spent $3 million on that useless car and sold it a week later just because I was bored." He once laughed while sipping his expensive scotch. Everyone clapped. Shelter smiled too, but inside her heart felt like a suitcase packed too tightly, on the edge of bursting. The worst part wasn't his arrogance, it was how he used his generosity as a weapon. Every time she frowned, he reminded her, "Without me, you'd still be hawking aqua in Alubo." That line became his favorite hymn. It slipped from his mouth with ease, like poison disguised as praise. And each time he said it, it didn't just sting, it branded her. But she never cried in front of him. No. She saved her tears for the shower where water washed away her sobs like muddy footprints in the rain. When he slept, she lay awake staring at the chandelier above their bed, wondering how something so bright could feel so cold. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a fatted calf with hatred, she remembered from Proverbs 15 verse 17. And though she lived among fatted calves and chandeliers, her soul longed for herbs and love. Her phone, once a tool for pictures and gushing texts, now became a diary of silence. Nobody called to check in anymore. Her friends only reached out when Felix was throwing a party or needed an elegant hostess beside him. They didn't notice the fading in her eyes or the rehearsed laughter in her voice. She became a painting, beautiful, admired, and untouched. Even her parents now lived vicariously through her, telling neighbors how their daughter married into wealth and eats breakfast with gold spoons. But none of them saw the girl who stood in the walk-in closet, surrounded by designer gowns she never wore, whispering apologies to the reflection in the mirror. "I'm not ungrateful. she'd say, almost as if trying to convince herself. But gratitude should not feel like chains. One morning, Felix walked in while she was preparing his tea, and without warning, slapped the mug from her hand because the water wasn't hot enough. It shattered across the marble tiles, and so did something inside her. He didn't apologize. He never did. "Be careful next time," he said as he walked out, not realizing or not caring that her fingers were cut from the glass. That was the day she began keeping secrets, not the kind that destroy, but the kind that protect. She created a second email, opened a personal bank account in a name only she would recognize. She wasn't ready to leave yet, but a woman doesn't wait for the roof to collapse before she starts building an exit. So it was 3 weeks later, on an evening where the sky wore the colors of spilled wine, that the call came in. Shelter was in the kitchen, stirring soup she no longer enjoyed when her phone vibrated quietly beside the chopping board. "Good evening. Is this Mrs. Olanrawaju?" The voice was soft, almost trembling. Shelter responded with a cautious yes. A pause followed. Then the girl on the other end introduced herself as Lydia. "I'm not trying to cause problems," she said quickly, "but I think you deserve to know the truth." Shelter froze. Her heartbeat became thunder in her ears. Lydia continued, slow, careful, yet unwavering. She explained that she wasn't directly involved, but she was best friends with a woman named Tonia, who had been sleeping with Felix for almost a year. She told her everything: the hotel receipts, the surprise trips to Zanzibar, the hush money transfers. Shelter didn't ask questions. She just listened, her mind floating away from the kitchen, away from the soup, away from the girl who once believed that leaving Max would lead her to heaven. Lydia offered to send screenshots. She did. One by one, the images arrived. Chats, payments, photos. It wasn't just betrayal. It was performance. Felix had been conducting a symphony of infidelity right under her nose. Shelter didn't scream. She didn't break anything. She simply said thank you and ended the call. She leaned against the kitchen counter and closed her eyes. A memory flashed: Max, drenched in rain, holding groundnuts and milk. That day, she had chosen shine over shelter. Now, she lived in a palace where storms slept in her bed. The wind that evening was loud, as if God himself was unsettled. Shelter didn't cry. Instead, she stood in the garden, her arms folded, watching the security light flicker as the generator hummed. Her mind was no longer at war with confusion. Now, it was at peace with decision. She had given this life enough of herself, her time, her voice, her pride, but the cup had run over. That night, she sat with a notebook and began to write, not poetry, but a plan. Every detail was thought through with the patience of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She listed the contacts she would need, the discreet realtors she met at a party who had once offered to sell the house at the right price, the cousin who worked at the licensing office and could help transfer car documents quietly, and the bank manager who owed her a favor from years ago. Her hands didn't shake. Her handwriting didn't stammer. She wrote with the calmness of someone no longer afraid to lose a man who had already lost himself. "He that diggeth a pit shall fall into it," Ecclesiastes 10:8 reminded her, and she held that verse close like a dagger beneath her robe. She didn't rush the plan. She let it marinate. Because revenge is best served not just cold, but cooked with wisdom. And when the time came, she would not raise her voice. She would simply vanish. The first crack in her composure came not from the betrayal itself, but from the quiet afterward, the eerie calm that settled over her like fog in an abandoned street. Days passed, and Shelter did not confront Felix. Instead, she allowed herself to become a shadow in the house she once called a home. Her laughter, once loud and full-bodied like a songbird in early morning, was now stored in silence. She played her role like a seasoned actress, serving meals, fixing his tie, nodding when he spoke about business, pretending not to notice when he stayed out late, and returned smelling of foreign perfumes and fabric softeners that weren't hers. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. There's a wisdom that comes upon a woman who's been bruised without being broken, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't scratch, but observes with a stillness that is almost prophetic. Shelter began keeping a diary, not for memories, but for proof. Dates, receipts, car movements, money transfers. She built a case in whispers while Felix laughed in his sleep. It was during this quiet season that she found herself growing, like a seed pressed deep into the soil, shrouded in darkness yet slowly stretching towards something it couldn't yet see. She began to walk differently. Her eyes, once filled with need, now brimmed with clarity. She was no longer searching for validation. She had looked inside herself and realized that her worth was never something Felix had the power to measure. God never sleeps, and the same eyes that watched Hagar in the wilderness watched her too. For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed. Luke 12 verse 2 came to her one morning as she wiped the kitchen counter. She whispered it like a vow. She began testing the waters cautiously, like a swimmer unsure of the current. The first step was reaching out to the discreet real estate contact she remembered from an old party, a woman named Ifioma with sharp cheekbones and sharper instincts. Ifioma worked with a niche group of buyers who valued confidentiality, and when Shelter sent her a message saying she was ready to talk business, the response came swiftly. They met at a spa under the guise of discussing skincare treatments, but beneath the aroma of lavender oil and eucalyptus, numbers were exchanged and plans whispered. Shelter described the house as available under certain conditions, and Ifioma nodded knowingly. The deal would be quiet, under the table, with the right documents forged to keep Felix's name far from the trail. Shelter had no intention of fighting him in court. She wasn't seeking justice. She was seeking freedom. The second move was retrieving the car documents, which Felix had left in a study drawer without much thought. Shelter made copies, hid them behind the lining of an old handbag, and left the originals untouched. She also contacted her cousin Dare, who worked as a logistics supervisor at the vehicle registration office. She told him half the truth and paid him to begin a soft transfer process under her name. Each day felt like chess, each movement calculated. But this wasn't about being cunning. It was about surviving. She began to transfer small amounts of money to a hidden savings account, testing Felix's alertness. He didn't notice. He was too busy feeding his ego, too wrapped up in his double life to realize his own walls were closing in. The Bible says in Proverbs 26 verse 27, "Whoso diggeth a pit shall fall therein." Shelter wasn't digging pits. She was setting tables. The night before the house sale was finalized, Shelter lay beside Felix pretending to sleep. Her eyes were open, fixed on the blinking light of the air conditioner, her mind rehearsing every step she would take the next day. The buyer would wire the payment by noon. The lawyer, paid in cash, would handle the final paperwork with Ifioma. Shelter had already moved a significant amount into her private account using a chain of third-party platforms. She packed slowly, items she needed, memories she wanted to keep. The rest could rot in the walls that had seen too much silence and swallowed too many tears. She didn't feel guilty. She didn't even feel triumphant. There was only a strange stillness in her chest, like the moment right before a long-awaited rainfall. Felix had once told her during a heated argument that women were replaceable, like housemaids. Once one fails, get another. She never forgot that. And now, he would forget everything, his security code, his safe combinations, his wife's middle name, until he realized what was gone could not be replaced. That morning, she made his breakfast with hands that no longer trembled. He didn't notice that her eyes didn't look at him. He didn't see that her smile didn't reach her cheeks. He didn't ask where she was going that afternoon, and she didn't tell him. She left wearing her simplest clothes and carried only one bag, walking out like someone stepping through a door that had been open all along. That afternoon, when the deal was executed, it was almost too smooth, like a blade through ripe fruit. The money hit her account in phases, spread across 3 bank names. She stood inside the buyer's office, sipping water and nodding as documents passed from hand to hand. She signed without hesitation. The final stamp came with a sound that echoed in her spirit like a bell, an ending, a beginning. As she walked out, the Lego sun hit her face, but instead of shielding her eyes, she welcomed it. For the first time in years, she felt her body breathing on its own, not just surviving, but existing. She took a Kiki to a short-let apartment on the mainland that her friend Amaka had secured under an alias. She changed her phone number, turned off her social media, and sat quietly in the corner of the small flat, letting the silence speak. In that moment, she realized how powerful stillness could be. It was no longer the sound of submission, it was the sound of strategy fulfilled. When she received the message from her cousin Dare confirming the car papers were now in her name, she simply responded with a single word, good. Later that night, as the stars blinked through the dusty Lagos sky, Shelter lay on a thin mattress and whispered into the ceiling, "The snare is broken, and we are escaped." Psalm 124 verse 7. It didn't sound like scripture. It sounded like a woman finally free. The day Felix returned from his Abuja trip, the sky looked deceitfully calm, as though the universe itself had paused to watch how the rest of Shelter's story would unfold. The housekeeper had already been dismissed, and the security man given indefinite leave. The compound stood like a clean stage waiting for its final act. Shelter wore a white blouse and simple jeans, her hair tied back in a scarf that gave no hint of her intentions. She cooked egusi soup that day, not because she wanted to serve him, but because it was what he liked, and the perfect bait didn't draw suspicion. Felix came in humming, dragging a carry-on suitcase and talking into two phones. "Honey, I sealed the deal," he boomed as he stepped in, not even waiting for a reply. Shelter smiled softly and responded with a neutral welcome. She served the food, sat at the far end of the table, and listened to him narrate half-truths and exaggerated exploits about his Abuja meetings. She nodded occasionally, laughing in the right places, but her mind was somewhere else, focused on what would happen that evening. Her hands remained steady even as she recalled the folders she had copied, the ones that revealed he was siphoning funds from his company through shell accounts and fake vendors' names. Documents he had foolishly kept unlocked on his laptop like a man who thought himself untouchable. Shelter had made copies of those files, printed them out, and hidden them with the same meticulous care she once used to preserve love. The irony wasn't lost on her. She once protected his dignity like it was her own. Now she would expose him without blinking. She waited until the sky darkened, not because the night gave her courage, but because the darkness offered her the stage she needed. She wore a plain dress and stepped into the corridor with the expression of someone heading to a prayer meeting. Felix was in his study, pacing as he spoke loudly into his phone about clearing in $25 million from the pipeline this quarter. Shelter stood by the door for a moment, just listening. Then, without knocking, she walked in and placed a brown envelope on his table. "What's this?" he asked, half distracted, scrolling through messages on his second phone. "Evidence," she replied softly. He laughed, a short, cruel sound that filled the room like smoke. "Evidence of what, Madam Spy?" he mocked, setting down the phone. But when he opened the envelope and began scanning the contents, the air shifted. His eyes narrowed. The room went silent except for the fan spinning overhead. He looked up slowly, his voice now lower, sharper. "Where did you get this?" She said nothing, just looked at him with the calmness of someone who had been burning for years and had finally become fireproof. "You're making a mistake, Shelter," he said, rising to his feet. But she had already stepped back. "I've made many. Loving you was the last." She walked out before he could speak again, and 10 minutes later, the front gate clanked open, and 2 officers from the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission entered with folded sleeves and quiet precision. Felix's roar from the living room was like that of a man drowning, not in water, but in the weight of his own pride. Shelter didn't watch him get handcuffed. She just picked up her handbag and walked out the back door. For 3 days after his arrest, she returned to the house not to mourn, but to disassemble. She moved like someone clearing the remnants of a life that had collapsed. The paintings were taken down, the shoes boxed, important documents sorted and folded. She didn't rush. Each movement was deliberate, respectful, as if she was burying something that once had meaning but had since gone sour. Friends called her phone, some genuinely worried, others fishing for gossip. She ignored them all. The only person she contacted was Amaka, who helped coordinate the final clearing of the house. By the time the EFCC released Felix on bail, the mansion no longer felt like home. It felt like an empty photograph, beautiful but meaningless. Shelter transferred the remaining funds to her secure account, closed the house gate one last time, and dropped the key at Ifeoma's office. She didn't cry, not even when she looked back at the building that once promised her everything and gave her nothing. The walls had held her silence for too long, and now they could listen to themselves. A fool's mouth is his destruction, Proverbs 18 verse 7 echoed in her mind as she boarded a taxi to the mainland. She left behind no letter, no message, just the consequence of a man's belief that a woman who smiles in silence is a woman defeated. He was wrong. Felix returned to a house that had been stripped to the bones. No curtains. No furniture, no staff, no car in the driveway. The garage echoed when he stepped in. His footsteps bounced back at him like an accusation. He ran upstairs and found empty closets, boxes gone. Even the small trinkets he once mocked now vanished. He opened his bank app and blinked. The numbers had changed, dramatically. His hands trembled as he refreshed again and again, the red notifications blinking like tiny alarms. His laptop, once filled with transactions and reports, now stared at him with a wiped hard drive. He screamed. He punched a wall. He paced. But none of it could undo what had already been done. Shelter had not only taken what was legally hers, she had taken back her story. He sat on the bare floor of the master bedroom that night trying to piece together where it all went wrong. But the truth was not in the moment. It was in the years he spent believing she would never rise. In the months he treated her silence as approval. In the days he thought love could be bought and peace could be replaced. The truth was, Shelter didn't leave in one day. She had been leaving long before the first officer knocked. She had just waited for the right silence to close the door behind her. And when she did, she left behind not just a man, but a warning written in emptiness. In the quiet of her new apartment, tucked in a modest estate near Oregon, Shelter found a strange kind of peace that did not need noise to announce itself. It was not the kind that came with chandeliers or scented hallways, but the kind that accompanied a woman who had finally laid down the burden of pretending. The walls were plain, the windows small, and the fan made a constant rattling sound like a tired whisper, yet it felt more like home than any marble floor ever had. Every morning she brewed her tea without waiting for instructions. She woke not to the thudding sound of imported shoes or the fake cheer of house staff, but to the rhythmic sweep of her neighbor's broom and the distant cry of a street hawker advertising Acura. She began to cook again, not for obligation, but for the pleasure of feeding herself with her own hands. Even simple things, like folding her clothes or adjusting the curtain, began to carry new meaning. They were acts of freedom, quiet rituals of reclaiming her own space. She bought a small plant and placed it by the window, watching it grow leaf by leaf. It reminded her that healing, too, was a process, slow, delicate, and sometimes barely noticeable until one day you realize you've outgrown the pot you were once crammed into. And in the midst of her solitude, she discovered something else, her voice. She began writing again, journaling with a clarity that startled even her. Words poured from her pen like long-lost friends finding their way back. She wrote about pain, not to relive it, but to drain it. She wrote about love, not as a weakness, but as a memory worth honoring. And she wrote about Max, not with regret, but with a soft kind of gratitude. One afternoon, while walking back from a nearby market, her scarf tied loosely over her braids and her slippers making a flapping sound on the dusty road, she heard a familiar voice calling from behind. "Shelter?" She turned, slowly, cautiously, and there he was, Max. His frame hadn't changed much, still tall and narrow like an upright reed, but something about him looked fuller now. He had a quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't announce itself with noise, but settles gently like mist over a river. He wore a clean polo shirt tucked into dark jeans, and his beard, once a scattered afterthought, was now groomed like someone who finally understood his own worth. She stood still, unsure whether to smile or run. "It's been a while," he said, his tone even, his eyes not accusing but curious. She nodded slowly. "Yes, it has." They talked for a while under the shade of a mango tree, their conversation a gentle weaving of two lives that once ran parallel. Max told her he now worked with a growing electronics firm, supervising repairs and mentoring young apprentices. "I've built a small workshop," he added, pride dancing lightly in his voice. Shelter listened without interruption, her heart tugged by the familiarity of his rhythm. He didn't ask about Felix. He didn't need to. Some stories reveal themselves without invitation. Instead, he asked how she was doing, really doing. She looked at him, into those same eyes that once begged her to choose peace over pride, and for the first time in years, she told the truth. "I'm learning how to live again." He nodded slowly, not in pity, but in respect. Before parting, he handed her a paper bag, roasted ground nuts, and a small tin of milk. The same gift he once brought her in the rain. She didn't laugh this time. She held it close, and her fingers trembled, not from sadness, but from memory. Evenings became moments of soft reflection. Shelter sat often on her balcony, wrapped in a simple wrapper, sipping ginger tea as the day melted into the noise of crickets and generator hums. She had stopped asking where things went wrong, not because she had forgotten, but because some answers no longer mattered. What mattered now was how she lived forward. The pain had carved something in her, not bitterness, but a new depth. She was no longer the girl searching for validation in tailored suits or diamond bracelets. She now understood that true wealth had very little to do with digits in a bank account. She started volunteering at a local center where young girls were taught vocational skills: sewing, baking, coding. Many came with stories written in bruises and silences, and Shelter listened to them all without flinching. Her eyes had seen too much not to understand. "Let me not be full and deny you," she read one day from Proverbs 30 verse 9, "or poor and steal." She now craved balance, not extravagance, not poverty, but enough. The woman at the center often asked her why she was always calm, and she would smile faintly, responding, "Because I've walked through fire, and I didn't burn." She wasn't healing because someone saved her. She was healing because she stopped waiting to be saved. She had learned to kneel when needed, but also to stand. And most importantly, to walk forward. Felix tried reaching her only once. An unknown number rang her phone one evening, and when she answered, the voice was uncertain. "Shelter," he began. She didn't respond. There was a pause, then a hesitant, "Can we talk?" She thought for a moment. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unshaken. "I think we've said enough." He sighed on the other end, and then silence swallowed his reply. She hung up gently, placed the phone on the table, and let the moment pass like a breeze. She didn't cry. There was nothing left to grieve. He had not called to apologize, only to pull at strings that no longer held. She had already forgiven him, not for him, but for herself. Bitterness was a weight she could no longer afford to carry. That night, as she lay on her mattress, the ceiling fan squeaking above her, she felt a quiet fullness spread through her chest. Not joy exactly, but a peace that hummed like a lullaby. The world outside was still loud, still chaotic, still full of betrayal and noise. But inside her, there was calm, and it was enough. She reached for her journal and wrote only one line before drifting off to sleep. I was broken, but not destroyed. And somewhere deep in her spirit, a voice echoed, not hers, but divine, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Psalm 34, verse 18. She didn't need anything else. Not closure. Not applause. Just that stillness. And in it, she was whole. The morning Max showed up at the center where Shelter volunteered. The sun had just begun its lazy climb above the rooftops, bathing the street in the kind of light that makes everything feel like it's been forgiven. He wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a clean white shirt, navy blue trousers, and leather sandals, but there was a quiet pride in his walk, the kind that couldn't be bought or borrowed. Shelter had just finished helping a young girl thread her first line on the sewing machine when she heard his voice at the reception. It stopped her, not in fear or surprise, but in something she couldn't name. She walked out slowly, wiping her hands with a piece of ochre cloth, and found him standing there with a shy smile and a bag of bottled water. "I thought I'd stop by." "I wasn't sure if I should," he said, and she tilted her head slightly, lips curving into something soft. "You should," she replied. He handed her the water, but it was clear the gesture was just an excuse. There was something in his eyes, something that asked without demanding, that hoped without forcing. They sat outside on a broken wooden bench, surrounded by the laughter of children chasing one another in the field. Max didn't talk much, just observed. Shelter told him about the center, the girls, her new project to help them sell their crafts. "You always like to fix things," he said quietly. "Even people." She smiled and nodded. "I just never knew I needed fixing too." The conversation that followed was not drenched in apologies or coated with longing. It was plain, simple, like rice and palm oil, humble and satisfying. Max told her about the small tech shop he was building into a bigger workspace. He spoke about learning to manage boys fresh from street life, giving them tools, not lectures. Shelter listened intently, not just to his words, but to the maturity in his tone, the stability that now anchored him. There was no jealousy in her heart. "No bitterness. Yesternis. Puedes. Bes by so and no bitterness tarafel. No bitterness. Landarmos. Form for soul. No bitterness. No bitterness. My bitter now was no with us. Arabit. Just a tender awareness of what could have been and what still might be, not as a repeat of the past, but as a restoration through growth. He didn't ask why she left Felix or how it all happened. He simply said, "You don't owe me stories. You owe yourself peace." Those words stuck in her spirit like a scripture, though it was not from the Bible. She remembered 1 Peter 5, verse 10, which said, "After you have suffered a while, the God of all grace will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast." Maybe this moment of quiet companionship was part of that restoration. Max stood to leave after an hour, but before he did, he touched her hand gently. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "Just, if ever you feel like walking again, I'd like to walk beside you." Then he left, and Shelter sat there long after he was gone, staring at the same path he took, wondering if some beginnings had to come wrapped in endings first. Time became a quiet river, flowing steadily without hurry, and Shelter stopped counting the days. She didn't rush toward anything, didn't chase closure or love or milestones. Her life moved like a hymn now, soft verses of daily rituals and calm refrains of deep reflection. On some days, she would sit by her window and remember the marble floors she once swept with silent steps. Not with longing, but with the kind of respect you give to a wound that has healed but still remembers pain. Felix no longer called. She heard through the grapevine that he had downsized, sold off his remaining cars, and was now keeping a low profile. People said he was quieter now, more cautious, but Shelter didn't care to confirm. Let the past grow its own weeds. Her garden now bloomed elsewhere. She started saving up for a small property of her own, nothing grand, just a patch of earth with enough space for peace. When she wasn't working at the center, she started hosting storytelling nights at a nearby community hall. Women came with their children, bringing plates of jollof and chin-chin, and they shared stories, some funny, others heavy, all true. Shelter would often sit quietly until someone asked her to speak. When she did, she never spoke of Felix or betrayal. She spoke of rebirth, of finding one's breath again, of walking barefoot through fire and coming out with stronger feet. Scars are not shame, she once told them. They're just proof that healing happened. The evening Shelter decided to visit Max's workshop wasn't planned. She was passing through Surleer on her way to pick up fabrics when her Kiki got stuck in traffic. She looked to her left and saw the small wooden sign, Max Tech Repair Hub. She hesitated only briefly before paying the driver and stepping down. The shop had changed. It was brighter, cleaner, with glass counters displaying accessories and a back room filled with young boys, soldering, laughing, learning. Max was at the back, hunched over a circuit board. He looked up when he saw her, and his face lit up, not in surprise, but in something warmer. "I was hoping you'd come one day," he said. She smiled. "So was I." They talked again, this time without the need for caution or pretense. And when she stood to leave, Max didn't ask for a promise. He simply asked, "Would you like to take a walk?" She nodded, and they walked down the dusty street, side by side, their steps unhurried, their words few. A gentle wind followed them, and the trees swayed as if to bless their path. They weren't rushing toward a title or rekindling a label. They were simply two people who had once broken, and now found themselves whole enough to try again. No fanfare, hoorafur, firkwatsas and armitis, pompous, growth on bills, wordy one salve salvul, deal was awful, kintofu dikin. Well, they, one davy, presaib, one tau bundu det lurid, and one warosas, and thou were diverging in o servir de revedoas, will you be salfon, will the spirit of words efforts, non for the aftamo for the after examines what it was lives, will of you, they was the other, no it's it. Wonder what is it, Cassos Myris, one bond Quebecly Gerbis, one was for the six reason office, user Ben David Aviori. No audience. Just a quiet return to something real. And in that simple walk, beneath a fading sun and beside a man who once loved her with nothing but faith, Shelter finally felt like herself, unburdened, unowned, and deeply, quietly free. Dear listener, if there's anything to carry from this story, let it be this: never trade your peace for the illusion of comfort. The world may glamorize wealth, power, and position, but none of those things will ever fill the quiet corners of a heart that longs for genuine love and respect. Do not be deceived by noise that looks like progress or pride that disguises itself as strength. If love does not come with safety, kindness, and rest for your soul, it is not love. It is a cage wrapped in ribbon. And remember this: it is not weakness to walk away from what wounds you. It takes courage to say, "I deserve better," and even more strength to rebuild your life from the ground up. Healing is not immediate, and it is not always visible, but every small act of reclaiming your voice, your time, your space, that is healing. That is power. Life may throw you into fire, but like gold, you will come out purified. Let no one make you feel small for choosing peace over appearances. Your journey is your own, and there is no shame in starting over. Thank you for the listener of this story. Thank you for every soul that has been bruised but not broken, for every heart that has loved deeply even in the wrong places. I lift up every woman, every man who has walked through betrayal, silence, shame, or pain. Lord, begin a new thing in their lives. Where they have been diminished, lift them. Where they have been forgotten, remember them. Where their strength has failed, restore them. Let peace fill the spaces that sorrow once occupied. Let wisdom flood the places where confusion once ruled. Open doors that no man can shut, and shut the ones that only brought harm. May they walk boldly in rooms they were once too scared to enter. May they smile again, not from pretending, but from deep divine joy. We declare that no weapon formed against their peace shall prosper. That those who rise from ashes will not just survive, but shine. Let your word in Isaiah 61 verse 3 be fulfilled. Give them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, and a garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. In the name above every name, Jesus. And hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.